Hello, Professor van Bunge. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We want to start right away with the philosophy because in the introduction of this episode, I covered a bit of Spinoza's life and his works. But in fact, I want to start with a warm-up question, namely, in the beginning of a documentary about Spinoza that you hosted on national television some years ago, you go to the Vatican and you ask to see one of the manuscripts of Spinoza's Ethics, of which we will talk about a lot. And you discovered there that things are not that simple. So if you could recount that story for us, that would be very nice.
Yeah. Well, it had taken the director many months of strenuous negotiations with the Vatican Library in order to get access so that we could actually film the manuscript. And, once we arrived, we were not allowed to discuss the manuscript. We were not allowed to discuss its contents, the interesting way in which it ended up in the Vatican Library. It had only been recently discovered, of course. We didn't know it was there, so it was and it is a very special manuscript because it is the oldest manuscript we now have of the Ethics. We know Spinoza completed the book in 1675. This manuscript dates from that period. It was only published, of course, after his death in 1677, early 1678. But again, we're not allowed to discuss Spinoza's philosophy at all, and not in the library, but we were even told that it was impossible to talk about Spinoza in the Vatican. Now, the Vatican is not such a massive state, of course. But, so he was, in a weird sense, he was still persona non grata. This, of course, we showed this in the documentary because it was impossible not to show it. Because as soon as I started asking questions about, well, how did it get here, and how do you feel about owning such a wonderful thing and such a great? They shut up, and that was we couldn't go there. It was actually much worse. In a sense, I don't want to sound ungrateful. Otherwise, we were received very kindly there. But something very odd happened there as well. At first, they come up with a wrong manuscript. Oh. So they have you have this shot in which I'm given this manuscript, and for God's sake, I couldn't make head nor tails of it.
So you figured out that it wasn't Spinoza's Ethics?
For one thing, it looked like I thought this is 16th century theology, but it's... I know what the Ethics looks like. I've read the book.
Yeah, that's in one way, yeah.
What is this?
So the scene in which you hold the book and look at it,
that was the second. That was the second.
The second book.
That was the second book. So and at first they refused to take any action. No, we're the librarians. We know what we're having. I said, I'm sorry, this is not Spinoza's Ethics. Upon which she suddenly grabbed the manuscript that I was given from my hands and returned with a real thing, which again we were not allowed to discuss. Still very touchy subject.
What is it about Spinoza that is so original and was so original then and so scary or dangerous now in relationship to theology and the idea of God?
I think there's a lot. There's much. I must also, perhaps it is good to, of course, there's so much emphasis has been put, especially recently, on his novelty, on the radical nature of his thought. Let's not forget a few things about Spinoza, of course, as a philosopher, are perfectly traditional. He published exclusively in Latin at a time in which many of his colleagues had adopted the vernacular. Bacon publishes in English already. Descartes in French. Hobbes writes his Leviathan in English, has it translated afterwards into Latin. In that sense, Spinoza is actually pretty old-fashioned. And since he wrote Latin, he uses a conceptual vocabulary, a philosophical terminology that looks pretty old-fashioned as well. It looks like a scholastic. He uses scholastic terms: substance, attribute, modes.
Yes.
The wonderful
Aristotelian sound.
Aristotelian, absolutely. Yeah. Which other concepts? Well, there were no other concepts available. Of course, you could easily say, but if this is the tool you're given, the wonderful thing about, or the exciting thing about Spinoza is that he actually creates what an Italian colleague once called a semantic revolution. He adopts this traditional vocabulary and ends up with a philosophy that in many ways was revolutionary and that marked a sharp departure from the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. And we know, if you read his correspondence, we only have a few letters, but it's very telling correspondence. He shows an acute awareness of the big difference, the gap separating him from tradition, if you will. And he tells us Christians believe in a God who is transcendent, a transcendent God, a God who has created nature, created the universe, and is above, beyond nature, that can in no way be identified with nature. Whereas I believe, as I have argued, it's not a matter of belief. I mean, he actually demonstrates, he tries to demonstrate the indubitable truth of his own philosophy. We should start thinking about this God as the immanent cause of nature, a God who works in nature and cannot genuinely be separated from nature. This, of course, also marks a sharp departure from Descartes. Descartes uses God as the creator of the two substances, matter and mind, the two halves of reality, of created reality. He calls these two things substances. Spinoza, by a redefinition, if you will, of the Cartesian concept of substance and its attributes, ends up with this idea that in reality there can be only one substance, which is God, and which equates with nature. Deus sive natura.
Yeah.
It's the famous quote. Everything which exists, according to Descartes, is a modification of either mind or matter. Human beings, as a result, are a compound of two different substances. They have a body and a soul. According to Spinoza, everything which exists is the product of God's attributes. Mind and body, or as he calls it, thought and extension, are only two of God's infinite number of attributes that are each infinite in their own kind, that constitute God's essence.
I think we could easily discuss this distinction between the Judeo-Christian God, who is like this father-like figure, and the Spinoza's God, who is equated with nature in some sense, and it's much more philosophical, and it's much more dense. But it's called the ethics, right? So it has to do with us as individuals. It has to do with our roles, roles in it. So a term that often pops up when you read about Spinoza is that it's determinism. Maybe we can unpack that in order to arrive eventually at what Spinoza thought of the individual, the later book. So what is determinism when it comes to Spinoza?
Well, it's the affirmation that everything which exists by necessity. The things that happen couldn't have happened in any other way, in view of the fact that they are the product of God's equally necessary existence. To many of his early readers, of course, this created a huge problem. Mind you, Calvinist readers of Spinoza were, of course, used or in the sense schooled in this tradition. Of course, it's different, but there is a certain similarity, because they believed in divine predestination.
Yeah, it's a close idea.
It's a close idea. And Orthodox Calvinists, like Spinoza, denied that there was such a thing as a free will enabling you to attain salvation, or turning you into responsible for the evil that happens. Spinoza's idea is that we are misled by the notion of a free will, which is completely mistaken, basically on two counts. In the first place, there is no such thing as a will. I mean, this is a Cartesian mistake, according to Spinoza, according to Descartes. Human beings have a number of faculties, which together are responsible for what goes on in our minds. Spinoza is a nominalist. This is in itself a very interesting fact, first pointed out by Wiep van Bunge, a Dutch Spinoza expert who wrote his thesis on the issue in the 1960s. I mean, most nominalists tend to be empiricists. Here, Spinoza is a bit of a rationalist and a nominalist, which is an interesting combination.
Just very briefly, what does that mean, a nominalist?
A nominalist, this is of course a term that derives from medieval philosophy, is a philosopher who denies the real existence of abstract ideas, the true, the good, the one, or in this particular case, the will. Spinoza goes a long way to actually helps us to understand why this notion is so popular and why most of us actually believe we have a free will, this faculty.
As we do nowadays.
As we do nowadays, and why it's so dear to us.
Yeah.
The fact is that we feel this appetite in us. We have an appetite. I mean, we may live in a predetermined universe. We may be subject to natural laws that allow for no escape. But this does not mean that we are, as created modes, produced modes, merely passive. Everything which exists, and according to many experts, this is actually the most important proposition in the entire ethics. This is proposition 6 from book 3. Everything which exists has this tendency to persevere in its existence. It's the famous conatus theory. We all have a conatus. Things, to put it very bluntly, do not spontaneously commit suicide. Things, they do not want to, but they have this appetite for existence. The same holds true for us. So we feel in ourselves appetites, desires, ambitions, if you will. But in reality, they are nothing but a succession of mental contents. That's what our consciousness is made up of. A succession of mental states, seducing us to suppose that these mental states are actually the product of our faculties, including the will, but that's a mistake. There's no such thing as a will.
This image of our place in nature is quite disturbing, let's say.
Spinoza is pretty honest about this, and he actually tells us the fact is, it's in Conatus Politicus, that I write about man as he is, not as we should like him to be. So he has to be brutally, he at least claims to be brutally honest.
But it's not a pessimistic worldview, isn't it?
No, not at all. I mean, he was of course often associated with determinism, often associated with fatalism, of course. But in modern philosophy, there is such a thing as compatibilism. Yes. I mean, Strawson wrote this wonderful paper on freedom and resentment. I mean, Spinoza comes up. I mean, as you say, the book is called The Ethics. It's about human behavior. And he essentially comes up with a new understanding of what freedom of what freedom is. Freedom is the ability to act according to your own nature, or so Spinoza tells us. Now, how do you increase your ability to act according to your own nature? By increasing the knowledge. This is, of course, the key to the entire operation, if you will, of the ethics, is to increase the knowledge of the way in which you are part of nature, in which you are constantly condemned, if you will, to interact with the rest of nature. The claim is that increased knowledge of and insight into the way in which we interact with the rest of nature not only produces a singular joy, which lifts your conatus, it will actually increase your autonomy or increase your ability to act not according to the rest of the world, but according to yourself.
Yeah. So this is, I think, one of the most, in reading the ethics, if you go through the trouble of reading through the ethics, which is a very difficult text, I think this is the moment when you're rewarded.
Joy of
Yes, you're rewarded for going through that struggle, and it is a struggle, let's be honest, because you think, oh, so taking away the free will does not mean that we take away things like freedom and happiness.
Not
and
at all.
like you explained, it is in fact a way towards re-understanding.
Absolutely.
And what I also find very rewarding is that another danger is that when you take away free will, you take away responsibility, because you get reactions such as, well, if there's no free will and I'm the result, you know, that old argument.
No.
But that's not what happens, isn't it? It's not like we're irresponsible.
Absolutely. I mean, why did Spinoza come up with a pretty detailed political philosophy?
Yeah.
His critique of theology. I mean, we are in a position, as part of our ability to increase our conatus and to further our well-being, we are in a position to create the societal conditions under which as many people as possible actually reach this level of understanding and actually become philosophers. I mean, this is why he writes a book in favor of the libertas philosophandi.
That didn't go very well historically.
No. This is where I started my own research, and basically it destroyed his reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very major tragedy. I mean, the book was published anonymously in 1670, of course. Within 3 weeks, it was
Everybody knew.
The secret was out. And these were, of course, very troubled times. 2 years later, we have, of course, the year of disaster. The Republic essentially collapses. So the Republic is in a state of complete political chaos.
Because this freedom needs certain can be
Absolutely.
taken away, so it needs political conditions.
Absolutely. This is why Spinoza started to write in the first place. We know exactly why he did so. There's a very famous letter to Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society.
Well known,
Secretary of the Royal Society, that had become something of a friend, and with whom he exchanges a number of extremely important, very interesting letters. And to whom he tells, well, I've started an entirely new book. This is 1665, in which this will become the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, of course. And one of the reasons why he does, well, there are several reasons, because he sees the celebrated freedom of the Dutch Republic, the so-called ware vrijheid, the true freedom, that only truly came into its own during the first stadholder's period, of course, the period of De Witt, was under threat. It was under threat from theologians. And well, let's face it, within a few years' time, one of his friends, Adriaan Courbach, is arrested.
Yeah, and De Witt as well.
And De Witt is butchered in the streets, cannibalized. I mean, it's horrendous. There's another reason. He wants to fight. This is interesting, of course, and also sad in a sense, unfortunate. He wants to counter the rumors according to which I'm an atheist. There were these rumors around, we know this, although it had, of course, been the tragedy of the Ban. He had been excommunicated from the Jewish community as early as 1656, but we know that by the late 1950s and 1650s and early 1660s, rumors had started to spread, both in Amsterdam but also in Voorburg, where he was living at the time, about this atheist Jew, this outcast Jew that was concocting this weird atheist philosophy. Rumors were, he wanted to stop these rumors.
It is interesting to look at his impact maybe further than the 18th and 19th century, because there is a lot of interest for Spinoza nowadays, and you might be thinking, how can that be? Because we're almost 400 years separated by him.
Yeah.
But there is a constant, especially in the late part of the 20th century, there's a constant interest for Spinoza. So even though immediately afterwards he might have been discarded for a variety of reasons, nowadays people go back to him and rediscover him, so to speak. How do you experience that?
Yeah, well, I know it's true. I mean, there is such a remarkable fact that the Dutch Spinoza Society, which was established in the late 19th century, is the largest philosophical society in the Netherlands. That in itself, of course, is weird or interesting. I think there are several. You have to look at this at several levels. When I talk about a phenomenon such as the Dutch Spinoza Society, you're essentially talking about laymen. And these people are not academic philosophers, they're not professors of philosophy at university. They're a collection of dentists, of accountants, of students, of what have you. People who have this fascination with this philosopher. Why? I think this has a lot to do with the pretty rapid and very radical secularization which took place in Dutch society during the 1960s and 1970s, when all of a sudden the churches were abandoned and theological authority collapsed, which leaves many people, or at least some people, with a certain vacuum. There are big questions that you want to think about. And as a matter of fact, Spinoza allows you to do so. He allows you to talk about nature, about God, about the soul, without it becoming
theology
or New Age,
or
I mean, there are many dangers associated with this kind of talk. I mean, it really happened to me. I once had a lecture at the Dutch Spinoza Society, and afterwards, this fellow comes up to me and tells me the wonderful thing about I believe he was a bricklayer. I mean, no connection with the kind of academic research that we engage in. No, the wonderful thing about Spinoza is it allows me to talk about God without having to believe in him. I mean, there is a desire. There is, at a completely different level, of course, there's the academic interest in Spinoza, in French philosophy, for instance. As you said, it's during the 1960s it all started. And we know, as a matter of fact, this has actually been demonstrated bibliographically. I mean, Spinoza's study starts to have this renaissance. The academic research into the contents of his philosophy, the consequences of the logic of the system, if you will, but its historical context. It all started end of the 1960s in Paris, when all of a sudden a number of very major new books came out, and a new kind of Spinoza was being presented here. Is Spinoza who not only abandoned the tradition that we started with, the Judeo-Christian tradition, according to which there is a transcendent God. No, he also abandons the logic of Cartesianism, which has, to a large extent, defined the history of modern philosophy. Ever since Descartes, so-called modern philosophy has been obsessed with the subject. The first truth established by Descartes is, of course, the cogito. I can doubt whatever I want, but I cannot doubt the fact that when I doubt, I think. So as a consequence, this is the first truth. I mean, this goes on to Kant, his transcendental philosophy, to Husserl, even the philosophy of language. They're all languages, they're all philosophies. In all these projects, philosophy takes its point from departure, its starting point from the subject. When you read the Ethics, Spinoza does not start with a cogito. No. Mens. the mind, is only the subject of Spinoza's philosophy in book 2. His first book is about God. First God, and it's from God's existence, or the existence of nature, if you will, that he deduces the existence of the subject upon which he comes into his own writing, his ethics. Yeah. So he returns the order. He says goodbye. He abandons this subjectivist trend in, this potentially idealist trend in philosophy, and I think that played a key part in the new interest in Spinoza. Because, as a French colleague of mine once remarked, he is in a very real sense a much more realistic philosopher. I mean, the early critics of Descartes were already confused about the fact that Descartes it looked as if Descartes had somehow managed to deduce the existence of God from the existence of Descartes. First, we establish that I exist, next we accept that God exists. Spinoza is much more realistic. I mean, the fact that we exist is the result of the existence of nature.
Well, thank you very much. This has been enlightening in more ways than one. And hopefully we'll keep in touch and we'll discuss further.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.